Today we're picking up with the first section of chapter 15, which is on monetary policy in our subsection 15.1. So what's this entire chapter 15, what's it going to all be about? Well, it's going to be about the effectiveness of what's called monetary policy. Now, monetary policy means specifically that the government is trying to manipulate the economy by controlling the money supply. Now, by manipulate, I don't mean that in a bad way. Manipulate in the sense of trying to make a change in it. Now, you remember in earlier chapters, we discussed the business cycle, and we know that there are times when capitalist economies go into a recession. So one thing we would like to do is when the economy is sliding downward into a recession, it sure would be nice if there was some kind of policy the government could pursue that would tend to buoy the economy up. And vice versa, if the economy is growing too rapidly and is overheating, it would be nice if there was some kind of policy that could slow it down a little bit to keep it on a sustainable path. So the idea of monetary policy is the government is going to manipulate the economy both in good times and bad times, in counter-cyclical means in order to try to make sure that the economy is growing on a nice even path. And we're going to be in this chapter focusing strictly on the government's ability to control the money supply. So we need to answer questions such as what's the relationship between the money supply, interest rates, aggregate demand in the whole system? How can the Federal Reserve use its control of the money supply or interest rates to alter the macroeconomic outcomes, which is just a fancy way of saying how do we prevent the recessions and how do we stimulate ourselves out of a recession and how do we slow down an economic boom? And then last but not least, how effective is monetary policy, meaning the control of money supply, compared to fiscal policy? And fiscal policy, which we'll deal in another chapter, fiscal policy is all about using government spending. We're talking about using taxing authority and the money that we collect in taxes and spend. How does it affect the economy? And which one is more powerful? Which one works better? And that's what we're going to try to understand by the end of this semester. So in order to understand the money policy, the monetary policy, we need to understand what's called a money market. Now this might sound a little strange, the idea that you would buy and sell money, because that's what markets do, right? Markets are places where buyers and sellers get together. But in fact, there really is buying and selling of money within our own society. Now, of course, that buying is in quote marks, it's more metaphorical, but it operates the same as if we were buying and selling. So in every market, there's both a supplier and a demander. For money markets, the money supply is controlled by the Federal Reserve through the mechanisms we talked about in the previous chapters. The ability to control the reserve requirement controls how much excess reserves there are, and then of course the excess reserves get lent out by banks and create more money, but the total amount of money that it can grow to will be determined by the Federal Reserve's control of the reserve requirements. So we recognize that the Federal Reserve has the ultimate control over the supply of money. But of course, they don't control the demand for money. The demand for money comes from individuals. Each one of us wants to hold a certain amount of money. Now, as in every other market, we realize that a certain price called the equilibrium price balances the demand and the supply. Well, we're going to find out the same thing's true in the money market. Only here, the price of the money is going to be the interest rate. And last but not least, let's continue with our slide. At high interest rates, money is expensive to acquire. That should be pretty obvious, common sense, right? If you want to use your credit cards or you want to get a homeowner's equity loan or whatever to build up the cash in your checking account, well, it's going to cost you, if interest rates are high, that's going to be an expensive thing to do. And you would expect that rational people would avoid taking out as many loans to acquire cash during high interest rate environments. And then when interest rates are cheap, then of course money is cheap to acquire, and you would expect people to want to hold more. So we're going to find out that people are going to respond to the price of money pretty much the way they respond to the price of any other normal good, where the more expensive it is, the less you want of it, the cheaper it is, the more of it that you do want. Now let's get back into our source of money supply and demand. I mentioned that the government controls the money supply, but let's do a quick reminder of what we mean by the money supply. Remember, we had two definitions, which we did in the previous chapter. The M1 definition is what? Currency held by the public. balances in your transactions accounts, which are usually checking accounts, and what's not on this list is traveler's checks. But as I mentioned, they're such a small part of the system nowadays that we can safely ignore them for now, as long as you remember when we do the exam that traveler's checks are in the M1 money supply. Now, the M1 definition of money is the most liquid form of money because everything, either currency or checks, can be used immediately for purchasing as a transactions balance. Now, there's another definition, money supply 2 or M2, which includes M1 and then adds on top of that savings accounts and money market mutual funds. Now, money market savings accounts are pretty liquid, especially nowadays with electronic banking, where you can transfer money from your savings account into your checking account and then immediately write a check. A savings account is pretty darn close to being available cash. So that's why we're including it in this secondary definition of money supply. And of course, the same thing is true with money market mutual funds. Even though they are investments, they're investments in very, very liquid assets, and money market mutual funds usually give you check writing privileges, so they treat it pretty much like a checking account. So the money market accounts are included in M2. So those will be the supplies of money. This is where money comes from. And then, of course, we have to have a demand for money. This is the quantity of money that the public wants to hold at alternative interest rates. And by public, we mean everyone in the public. That would be individual consumers like you and me, but it would also include individual privately owned businesses would all be part of the public. Now, getting back to that price of money, remember the price of money is going to be, let's just read the slide together, then we'll make sense of it. So if people hold cash as M1, the foregone interest they could have earned is the opportunity cost of money that people choose to hold. So what does this mean? Well, one of the definitions of the cost of anything is the opportunity cost, and that's actually the preferred definition by economists. So even if there's no actual charge to you, there is the opportunity cost of that which you have foregone. Let me give you an example. Let's assume you have 10,000 bucks. Now, you have two things you could do with the money. To make it simple, let's make it only two things. You can hold it as cash in your checking account, and of course earning 0 interest, or you could buy a government bond paying 5%. If you choose to hold the money as cash in your checking account, does it cost you anything? An economist would say yes. Even though the bank doesn't charge you interest for putting your money in the checking account, it appears to be free, but an economist would say no, you could have easily earned 5% by keeping it in a bond. By the fact that you chose not to, keeping it in cash cost you the 5% you could have earned. So even when there's no charge on something, there's often an opportunity cost. And that's true for the vast majority of money holdings. You're not literally charged for it, but it does cost you something because you could have been holding an interest earning bond instead. So that's what that first bullet point's about. And then just applying common logic, we know at low interest rates, the opportunity cost of holding money is low. For instance, let's assume that the bonds were paying only 1%. Now you have a choice between keeping it in your checking account at 0% or to go into the trouble of taking your money out of the checking account, investing it in a bond, and running the risk that the bond could either rise or fall in value and only earn 1%. You probably don't feel very motivated, do you? But what if the interest rates were very high? What if the interest rates were 10%? And that money that you have, the $10,000, is just sitting in a checking account earning 0 when you could have been earning $1,000 a year on it by putting it in a bond. All of a sudden, now you start to realize those bonds look a whole lot better, and holding cash doesn't look like a very smart play, does it? So then you would be motivated to take your money out of money and put it into a financial security called a bond. The point, of course, is that I hope you all recognize economics is all about basic common sense. Just think about how you personally would behave when confronted with these different scenarios, and how do you think most other people would behave when confronted with the same variable. Then you start to realize that economics is built brick by brick by brick on just understanding ordinary human behavior and what motivates people. People are relatively self-interested. They want to make themselves as better off as they can be, and they will do whatever is, within the law, of course, they will do whatever is necessary to move from a position of low satisfaction to a a situation of higher satisfaction. And so you now have to, or you should realize that people now make the perfectly logical decisions to change their behavior when the cost of different things change. Now let's get back into that demand for money and think about why people would want to hold money instead of just simply keeping everything they own in a financial security. The securities earn interest. Why does anyone hold a checking account? Well, here we have three reasons. The first one's called transactions demand. So this is money held for the purpose of making everyday market purchases. So I'll give you my own personal example. I get paid once a month. So my check shows up on the very first day of the month. Now I could take all that money and convert it into a bond and earn interest, but then I wouldn't have any money to pay my mortgage payment, my car payment, restaurants, all the different things I'm going to do during the month. I need to have cash in the bank. Now, that would be transactions demand. So a certain amount of all of the assets I own, I want to keep it in the form of money so that whenever I decide to pop into a restaurant, I have money available. Now, of course, it doesn't have to be physical cash, but as long as it's in my account, I know I can use my debit card and access it and go to a restaurant whenever I feel like it. Now, the second one's called a precautionary demand. This is money held for unexpected market transactions or for emergencies. So not only do I have to keep a certain amount of cash just to handle my everyday market purchases, it's really smart to keep a certain amount of money as kind of like an insurance reserve. For instance, what would you do if you ran over a nail on the highway and you had a tire blowout and you had to go replace the tire? Well, if you only kept literally the amount of money in your checking account that just covered your everyday market purchases, then all of a sudden you'd be in a world of hurt, wouldn't you? Because now you're at the tire store and you look at your bank balance and say, I only have enough money here for groceries. I don't have enough money to pay for this tire. You'd be out of luck, stuck on the side of the road. So most of us are not willing to do that. So we usually keep a cushion above the mere minimum transactions demand we keep in reserve to handle emergencies like this, right? And then last but not least, something called speculative demand. This is money held for what's called speculative purposes, otherwise known as for later financial opportunities. So just pick, for many of us, depending on what your level of income is, the speculative demand may not be very high. But let's assume that you were a wealthy business person. You owned your own business and you have financial assets of around $500,000. Now, how much of that should you keep in cash? I presume you all realize that, that's going to get mighty expensive to keep it in cash, because if I could earn 5% on $500,000, that's $25,000 a year I'd be giving up just to keep all that in cash. But why might you keep a big chunk of cash laying around? Well, think about an opportunity. Let's say you hear about a house in your neighborhood that's gone up in foreclosure, but you know it's a great neighborhood and a good school district, and you say, wow, if I had some money laying around, I could make a bid on that house, and I could buy it cheap and then flip that house and make a couple $100,000. Now, would it make sense to keep a certain amount of cash laying around so that when those kinds of opportunities pop up, you're able to take advantage of them? Well, obviously, wealthy people think this way, and you will too. Hopefully, in your future, as you become a wealthier person, you will have to think about this as well. So these are three major motives why people choose to hold cash when they could be holding bonds or stocks or invested in something else. They choose to hold cash anyway. Now, in this particular slide, we're going to try to figure out where the interest rate comes from. And the interest rate's ultimately going to come in the money market by getting to equilibrium. Just like every other market, there's supply, there's demand. The two will intersect each other somewhere, and at some particular price, we get the quantity demanded by consumers to equal the quantity supplied by business people, right? We studied that multiple times in various economics classes, so we know that always is true. Let's take a look at for the money market and see why it's also true. So first of all, let's take a look at our diagram here. We see we have a downward sloping demand curve, and this should make sense. Let's pick 2 points on this demand curve to illustrate. This point on the demand curve says if interest rates were 9%, people would only want to hold G2 level of cash. Because at very high interest rates, you could be keeping your cash in a bond earning lots of money. So you would try to minimize your cash holdings as much as you can, obviously not to zero, because you have your transactions demand, your precautionary demand. Those two numbers, you can't get rid of those. You could cut down on your speculative demand and say, I'm not going to keep cash laying around hoping to pick up on a house that goes into foreclosure in the next 5 years when I could be earning 5% right or 9% right now. So you would reduce your speculative demand from G1 down to G2. So obviously, the higher the interest rate, the less cash you want to hold as cash. But as you can see, this is not going to be the equilibrium because this is G2 is what the demand is, but what's the supply? The supply, as you can see, is drawn as a vertical line. Now this is unusual. In every other supply and demand curve, the supply curve has an upward slope to it. But in this one, it has a perfectly inelastic supply. And that's because the money supply is not controlled by business people. Ultimately, the money supply is controlled by the government, the Federal Reserve in particular. And the Federal Reserve is not a money-making institution and therefore does not have to respond to the interest rates the way normal people do. So we're assuming that the Federal Reserve can set the money supply wherever they want it to be, and then consumers looking at their own demand curve end up intersecting with it. Now we know that long run, we're going to end up at E1 because it's always true that wherever the demand and the supply are equal to each other, they're always equal where they cross each other. In this particular example, 7% interest rate gets consumers to want G1 amount of cash in their checking accounts and cash, and the government has printed up G1 amount of cash. So the two numbers are exactly in balance with each other, and that takes place at equilibrium. In the next couple of slides, we're going to take a look at non-equilibrium situations to try to prove to everyone that the market will naturally move to E1. So let's go ahead and do that. So in this particular example, let's take a look at the interest rate starting out higher than equilibrium. In this case, you can see it's 9%. Now, at 9%, we've already gone through the reason, but we recognize that people are going to want to only hold G2 amount of cash, right? But the government has printed up G1 amount, and G1 amount is way bigger than G2. So is that a surplus of cash or a shortage of cash? If people only want G2 amount, but there's G1 amount printed, well, obviously there's a surplus. What do you know happens when anything's in a surplus? Well, the price of it goes down, right? Because there's more people in a surplus. There are more people trying to supply it than there are people trying to demand it. So what will happen to interest rates if there's more cash around than there are people trying to get a hold of it? Well, the interest rate, of course, can't stay up at 9%. It starts drifting downward. And as it drifts downward, what happens to the number of people willing to let their checking account balance get higher? Well, you can see that number gets, as we're going downhill, we're actually going what? Up in quantity of money. So as the interest rate goes down, people are willing to hold more cash in their checking account instead of scrambling to find ways to take it out and invest it in something else. Now let's take a look at another situation. What if interest rates were abnormally low? In this case, 6%. Well, at 6% interest, it's relatively cheap to just let money sit in your checking account, at least as compared to 9%, right? So you would expect that more people will let their checking accounts balloon up, so their demand for cash now goes all the way up to G3. Well, what's wrong with G3? Well, the reality is that there's only been G1 amount of money printed, so now what do we have? Do we have a shortage or do we have a surplus? Well, I presume you all can see that we have a surplus now, right? I'm sorry, we have a shortage because there's more people trying to get cash than there are amounts of cash. Whenever there's a shortage, what happens to the price of something? It goes up. In this case, it goes up from 6 all the way up to 7. Where will we finally stabilize? Why E1? Because any interest rate above 7, in this example, above E1, there will be what? A surplus of cash putting downward pressure on interest rates. Anytime the interest rate is below E1 or 7%, in this example, there will be a shortage of cash because there's more people trying to hold it than there are amounts of it available, and therefore there's a shortage of it. And as you all know, in shortages, prices go up. Only at E1 is the market in balance. So we know that just like in every other market, this market, the money market, also has an equilibrium, and the market naturally pushes itself toward the equilibrium because of either shortages or surpluses causing interest rates, or prices in this case, to move in the correct direction, getting people to change their behavior until their desires exactly equal the amount that is being supplied.